Hi, red.olaughlin here. We're on Talking Heads on the USA Global TV and Radio Network show. Let me get to my first slide. Okay, slide two. Let's get back to slide one. And this is, I believe, number three of a six-part series on mental health and mental illness. We spent the first couple two talking about brain health in general. And now we're going to actually delve into some of the mental illnesses that are plaguing everybody we know, basically. I think some of the latest worldwide data says that 1 in 8 people have some form of mental illness or disorder. And that could be something as simple as anxiety to depression to who knows what else. But anyway, as an introduction, there's a disclaimer. I'm a researcher. I research and explore, investigate, examine the human body at the cellular level. I look for cause and effect relationships. Treat a cause, you can fix a problem. Treat a symptom, and you'll always be treating symptoms. So if you know what causes something, maybe you can speed it up. Maybe you can slow it down. Maybe you can even just completely stop it. I mean, it's just a lot of things when you know what causes things to have happen. I have no medical background. I have no pharmaceutical background. I have a love of chemistry that goes back to my sophomore year in college. I fell in love with the subject. I got a degree in it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to become a chemist because I got an invitation to Vietnam. By the time I got back off active duty, my chemistry background was not current for and I got involved with other things, a lot of other things that are fine. But several years ago, my wife had breast cancer, and my love of chemistry caused me to look into what the side effects she was having from chemo, and was there something that could be done? And ironically enough, we were able to really and truly ameliorate a lot of those side effects and eventually get rid of literally every single one of them. So regardless, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. So let's talk about mental health, mental illness, and stuff. Uh, Definition of mental illness. These are conditions that involve changes in our emotions, our thinkings, our behaviors. Sometimes they're associated with stress, uh, but they're usually problems, and that we end up seeing that we don't operate the same when we're in a social environment, with family, at work, whatever. There's just a lot of issues there that all of a sudden this person is not quite the same, and that's. Let me go ahead and get to the next one. And part of the problem is the fact that maybe sometimes we're stressed. Our boss is having a bad day. Uh, you know, your spouse, your kids. I mean, there's a lot of issues just around us all the time. We just got finished going through a major election cycle here in the United States. There are some people very, very polar opposite ends, and there's just a lot of issues going on. And sometimes we have a little bit of anxiety from not knowing who's going to be doing what or whatever. And that anxiety in it and of itself is just normal stress, but it's not necessarily a mental illness. It's only when these things last forever and ever. So if we look at a mental illness, and then we hear this other terminology, it's called mental disorder. And that's saying, well, what's the difference? Well, we'll find out in just a brief moment the fact that there's no single term that we can lump everything into. So a mental disorder essentially shares the same qualities as a mental illness, but are very, very specific into what the symptoms are. And we'll be talking about those, like I talked about eating disorders. That's an eating disorder, something dealing with eating. But we have other terms that are used a lot interchangeably for some kind of mental problem. Might be a neurosis, a fixation, a quirk, mental derangement, mental disorder, mental disturbance, mental instability, psychological disorder, psychological maladjustment, personality disorder. But those are just terms. But what happens if we have a perfectly healthy brain, but somehow we end up with just maybe not the right balance of vitamins? I mean, something as simple as vitamin B12, you're deficient in it for more than a short period of time, and it mimics Alzheimer's. There are other B vitamins that if you're deficient in them long enough, you're going to end up with depression or depression-like symptoms. So poor mental health sometimes can be just a temporary problem until you get readjusted with whatever's causing that mental health, whether it's stress or diet or some other function going activity in your life. But generally, poor mental health refers to changes in our thinking, in our moods, and our behaviors. And most of the time, it has to do with some level of distress and some level of impaired function. Now, what's an impaired function? Let's say that we have a broke our ankle, and all of a sudden now we can't walk, or something's going on, and now I'm in a wheelchair for a short period of time. Just there's a lot of things there that all of a sudden we don't have the same ability we used to have. Um, so if I'm looking at mental illness and I want to know, what do we call these things? Well, typically mental illness has the categories of anxiety disorders. And these can be something from very, very mild restlessness, irritability, being worried all the time, to panic attacks, OCD, obsessive control disorder, depression, bipolar, mood disorders. Mainly, there we're talking about not just simple depression, but major depression, eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, even personality disorders. If we start getting into that area of being paranoid or schizoid or narcissistic. PTSD, a wide open topic. Psychotic disorders. Now we're starting to get into delusions and hallucinations, maybe some phobias, addictions. There's just all sorts of other things out there. But when we think of mental health, mental illness, sometimes the first thing that comes to mind is Alzheimer's or dementia. Well, that's a neurocognitive disorder. So it's a disorder, but it's about a specific subject. In this particular case, our brain. So if we're looking at neurocognitive issues as a disorder, that's when our Huntington's and our Parkinson's and there must be another half a dozen at least. Within dementia, I think Alzheimer's is about 60% of the problems there. But sometimes it's very, very difficult to diagnose. In fact, that's the primary issue with most of these kinds of mental issues, because you can have same symptoms of 3 or 4 different kinds of mental problems, but are the same causes it, or is it multiple causes? Are you really diagnosing it properly? Doctors aren't going to give you a blood test to find out if you're deficient in B12. Now, they may give you a B12 shot and see if anything changes, but it's just not one of the things they do. They have a lot of other things that they have to do, and they have a moral and a legal responsibility, if they know there's something wrong by the testing they're doing, to treat it. And that treatment sometimes, usually, is a pill. Sometimes it could be a therapy. Sometimes it can be a surgery. There's a lot of options on treating. But those things are, on a good day, difficult to diagnose, difficult to treat. And if you're not treating the cause of the problem, you're having a major problem with whatever. So I figured that for this particular presentation today and next Thursday, we'll be talking about anxiety, depression, bipolar, PTSD for today. The next week, we'll jump into schizophrenia, eating disorders, addictive behaviors, and dementia. Dementia may end up being a topic by itself. I covered that in a 6-part series dealing with Alzheimer's a few months ago. It's available on the USA Global TV and Radio Network. If you go into YouTube, you can find my series I did several months ago on Alzheimer's, the causes, pathways, and treatments. So let's just jump into anxiety. Anxiety, basic definition, and everything I'm telling you now, these are the generic things that are out there, not that you're low in iron and magnesium, and that's we're talking about these are the accepted everyday Google kinds of things that if I look at definitions and symptoms and causes and treatments, these are the generic things that are out there. Now, if you have anxiety, is it really a mental illness, or is it a temporary perturbation in your time life continuum? Is there something causing that anxiety? Maybe you have a test coming up. Maybe I'm sure a lot of people had anxiety with COVID, and there's a lot of residual. You're seeing people without masks. Maybe you're a mask person. Little things can create those kinds of problems. So, but a definition of anxiety is some kind of intense, excess, or persistent worry or fear about everyday situations. And these are it's a common thing. Now, if it's a temporary thing, not persistent, probably not a problem. But you have to identify what's causing your problem. Is it your brother-in-law? We don't know. What is the problem? You have to kind of, I'm only upset when I'm in this situation. Well, sometimes coworkers can be a problem child on a good day. Maybe all you need to do as a treatment for most stress, just avoid the stressor. Sometimes you can't. And there are options you have. But what are the symptoms of typically anxiety? And you'll see that symptoms are not always specific. You may have a symptom that for this mental illness, that mental illness, that mental illness. There's just a lot of different mental illnesses that have similar symptoms. And that's why it's so difficult to really and truly diagnose and treat effectively. So if your symptoms are uh, nervousness, restlessness, tenseness, you have a sense of some kind of impending danger, a panic, some doom coming about. We usually have an increased heart rate, our breathing increases, possibly sweating. You might even see your hands tremble a little bit. We have trouble concentrating or thinking about anything but whatever that panic or that danger thing that's out there. And as a result, we become fatigued, very tired quickly. And so as we're looking at these things, we're anxious about something, but then all of a sudden, if we're really and truly just super involved in it, we just get really fatigued and panicked out. What are some of the causes? Trauma, especially when you're younger, something going to happen to you, either a physical, mental, and we're talking about abuse, we're talking about a lot of things that residual in your brain. And sometimes it's even the fact that you didn't have something happen, but you were just neglected. It's not always a specific thing. It could be a stress. It could be an illness. Sometimes it's genetic. You can actually get anxiety from your parents. Sometimes it's drugs. And I'm talking about both prescription and over the counter, alcohol. And you might actually be anxiety from another mental health issue. So there's all sorts of causes in there. So if you're trying to treat a trauma and it's really brought on by drugs and alcohol, the trauma is not going to work. But most of the times when you look at a trauma, there are some specific kinds of cognitive therapies and things they want to do because that seems to work better with the trauma. But if you're stressed out, then maybe you need meditation and some other things in there. So what are the typical kinds of treatment that are used for anxiety? Well, number one, becoming better educated about whatever that particular, and it doesn't matter what the disease is, the better educated and aware you are of what the disease actually is and what options there are. Now, sometimes it's okay, bipolar, you can't cure it. Alzheimer's, you can't cure. Well, that doesn't mean you can't put it into a resting state and have a decent quality of life. But again, education. That's what this series here, Talking Heads, is all about. It's awareness, education, and then being able to take action based on what you have, but probably in concert with your physician so that you make sure everybody's going down the same street. Mindfulness, again, it's just I'm aware of something. Relaxation techniques. Sometimes these things you kind of visualize your body just relaxing muscle by muscle. Sometimes it's a breathing exercise. Pranayamas are what I use. Sometimes it might be EFT, emotional freedom techniques, where you do the tapping and with the mantras on that. Sometimes it may be just a simple matter of dietary adjustments. Maybe you haven't had B vitamins in a while for whatever reason, or maybe you're missing out on some other mineral. A lot of things can cause these problems, but if you're not aware of it from your self-education or from videos like this one, Dr. Google and Dr. YouTube have so much information out there. I highly recommend Dr. Berg, Berg. I do a lot of my research using him, and there's just so much information he puts out. Sometimes exercise is, ironically, you get more oxygen to the brain and things disappear. I read an article, in fact, I'll be writing a blog on it here shortly, about 2 weeks ago, that said that high intensity exercise actually was equally as effective in treating Alzheimer's as the leading three drugs. So now you have drugs that are they know what they do, but putting a person on a high intense exercise regimen, they found out they got the same level of cognitive response. Um, Building self-esteem. A lot of times we have problems with our anxiety because of how we see ourselves. And it's not something we think about very often at all. It's just, it is the way it is. That's the way I've always seen me. I'm too fat, I'm too thin, I'm not tall enough, not pretty enough, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But sometimes we have self-esteem issues. If that's part of the cause, then that's a relatively easy thing to fix. But again, if it was brought on by a trauma, they would prefer, whatever your doctor has, they would prefer some time of cognitive therapy. And there are many different kinds. We'll talk about that toward the end when we talk about PTSD. It may be brought on by a medicine. There are a lot of side effects of medicines that are depression, anxiety, and other things. And sometimes a doctor may say, you really need to be in a support group. And sometimes I find when my wife was going through breast cancer that some of the chemo drug support groups that I was analyzing and assessing, they had some great information that the doctors don't give you. So there's a lot of information out there. Let's talk about depression. Sometimes a little more intense than anxiety is defined as a persistent sadness and a lack of interest in or pleasure in things that previously had been enjoyable in our lives. Um, some of the symptoms are being sad all the time, maybe even tearing more often than you would ever have before. Now, a lot of times we see this, you lose a loved one. You know, just a mere thought, all of a sudden you can feel it in your chest, tears start coming, you can't talk, you get that chest, and that depression may be temporary because of the loss of a loved one. But sometimes it's not temporary. But if you have a continued feeling of emptiness or hopelessness, you get angry easily, you're irritable. Sometimes it shows up in sleep disturbances because you're stressed about something. And when you go to bed, those are things are still in your mind and you're focused on them and you can't let it go. And then you end up, the next step is insomnia. You can't even get to sleep at all. Or maybe the opposite. You get on the roller coaster ride on the other side and you can't wake up. These are all symptoms of depression. Now, is it curable? Yes. But you have to figure out what the cause is. So let's take a look at some of the causes and go from there. Many times, a childhood experience. Now, it could be a trauma, it could be literally anything that happened that was out of the norm that affected you. Now, it may not have affected your brothers and sisters. Maybe it's just something that happened to you. Don't know what it may be. Maybe a good friend of yours was killed in a boating accident. Maybe somebody drowned in a swimming pool. Things happen. We all perceive them. We react differently. Some people hold on to that stress. Other people let it go. But childhood experiences creep back into our mind periodically, and it can be a cause of depression. Sometimes life events, financial, relationships. It's just the whole gambit of everyday life that we have. And sometimes, you get beat over the head too many times. And you say, hey, uh, enough's enough. But again, it's not what happens to us. It's how we react to it and what we hold on to. There might be some other mental health issues that depression is a side effect from that. It could be some physical health issues. It could be genetics. I think about 5% of the times, most genetics are no more than 5%. But genetics, in many cases, is like a light switch. You can switch on a gene or switch off a gene. It's called epigenetics. And if you understand what causes that particular gene to be turned on or turned off, again, education, that is really and truly one of those remarkable things that you can control. Sometimes it's medications. In this particular case, I'm talking about prescription meds. It may be over-the-counter drugs. It might be something dealing with diet. And diet has such a primary effect on our brain that it's unbelievable. In fact, Dr. Berg says, and he believes honestly, that 50% of our mental illnesses are caused by sugar in some way, shape, or form. And I tend to agree with them. Sometimes, we get so wrapped up in things and we just overtrain. Maybe a single time or maybe multiple times. And depending on what I'm talking, single and multiple talks about the causes, not necessarily the overtraining. The overtraining is where you just can't stop doing what you're doing. But let's say you have a diet issue, over-the-counter drugs, maybe a physical health issue and some childhood experience. That's multiple causes. You got to treat each one. What are typical treatments? Well, the first thing doctor wants to do is go with medicines. That's what they know. That's what's approved in the courts. That's everything. Now, the question is it the right medicine for the cause? Because a lot of times it's masking things. But that's, for the professionals, that's what they do for a living. They may give you an antidepressant. They may give you a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. There's other things called serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs, some serotonin modulators. Serotonin is that really chemical in the brain. And so when we're starting to disrupt that chemical in the brain, now we have a problem. So tricyclic antidepressants, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAIs. They may even recommend psychotherapy. You're sitting down talking to somebody because of the nature. Maybe it's childhood disorder. And they say, we've had a lot of success if we can identify that and ameliorate that experience. I'm going to talk later on in the presentation about hypnotherapy. But exercise works great because we get oxygen. It's a de-stressor. It's just so many good things about exercise. It's unbelievable. Sleep, diet, all those things are good. Okay, bipolar used to be called manic depressive. Okay, what is it? It's a mental illness that causes unusual shifts in our mood, our energy, our activity levels, concentration, and basically the ability to be human on a day-to-day life, just being able to do the things we need to do. Now, I've run to many people and said, "Well, I'm bipolar," and then they're on the pills and they're fine. I know several people, and they're on the pills. All of a sudden, they feel fine, and they said, "I can control this," and they get off the pills and they go back to having because the pill was really a band-aid that got them through the day, but it didn't really fix the cause of the problem. What causes that, we'll get into in a second. But sometimes when you look at the issues there, where we have difficulty. So if I'm looking at symptoms of bipolar and I see mood swings, I see sadness, anger, anxiety, apathy. Sometimes we feel guilt, hopelessness, irritability all the time. Sometimes we increase our risk. We become more risk taking than we ever did before. Sometimes hyperactivity, delusions, depression, paranoia. Sometimes we have a weight gain or weight loss. That's a big deal for doctors. If you have anything more than about 10 pounds and it's not for a reason, that is a major cause of alarm bells go off when you have any kind of weight loss in particular or a weight gain. Sometimes just sleep issues, fatigue, rapid or frenzied speaking. All these things can isolate in on a bipolar, but we've already seen, anger and anxiety and other things that are already identified with other mental illnesses. So how do you really and truly separate out one from the other? Well, that's why we pay the big bucks to the physicians to do that. Now, bipolar is widely believed to be the result of chemical imbalances in the brain. Okay, so this is the first time we've actually recognized that the brain has maybe an imbalance from them. We're not getting the right uh, number of particular kinds of minerals, vitamins, nutrients. And if we have an imbalance, it can cause a problem. But when those imbalances are responsible for controlling the brain's functions, the neurotransmitters, we're talking about noradrenaline, serotonin, dopamine, those are the things that we end up seeing as bipolar. So we talked about serotonin in several cases in the last slide. So if we find out that it's a serotonin related imbalance and we can pull up more serotonin or have our bodies make more serotonin by the pills we're taking, then that sometimes kind of steadies things out and not we're fine. And sometimes even bipolar can be genetic. The typical treatments by a doctor is going to be your medications. You're going to have some kind of anticonvulsant, antipsychotic, your SSRIs, your serotonin, some therapy. And these therapies, again, if it's caused by a trauma, they want some kind of cognitive behavior or psychoeducation. Sometimes this bipolar may be of such a nature that they need to really control it by being hospitalized for a while. But then again, we can have nutritional issues that can cause it, of which exercise and sleep, if we're overacting, overtraining, if we're not getting the right quality sleep, we can adjust our exercise, we can adjust our sleep, we can adjust our nutrition and get back into what is the norm for our particular problem, our age and our everything. PTSD, we're getting here toward the end of things. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes syndrome, sometimes a couple, three other different ones. But it's an anxiety disorder. Again, disorder now because it's applied specifically to a particular set of circumstances. And they say that develops in reaction to a physical injury, a severe mental distress, an emotional distress caused by sometimes military combat, a violent assault, natural disaster, or other life-threatening events. But sometimes we get it just from COVID. I mean, because so many people watch the TV and are just, if it bleeds, it leads. You just get overwhelmed with everything. There's more than probably a couple cases of PTSD just brought on by the nature of COVID and how it threatens everybody. So it's one of those things that, yes, we can recognize that one probably easier than other ones. But what are some of the symptoms? Well, being easily startled or frightened. I'm sure you've seen this on TV where somebody has come back from the war, and all of a sudden they hear a backfire, who knows what, and they just, all of a sudden they're mentally awake and looking for a gun, or they're back in a corner all huddled. It doesn't matter. They're easily startled, easily frightened. They're always on guard for some kind of danger. Uh, Most of us don't have self-awareness. We go around, we have our cell phone in front of us, reading something, texting, whatever it may happen to be. We have no idea what's going on around us. People with PTSD are super aware of what's around them, always on guard for anything. Sometimes they have a self-destructive behavior. They end up drinking too much, driving too fast, other ones. Very often they have a problem sleeping because they can't concentrate just on the non-traumas, the panics, the dangers in their lives. Many times they're irritable. How many times have we had irritable in the first 4 mental illnesses we talked about? Angry outbursts, aggressive behavior, overwhelming guilt or shame. These are all symptoms associated with PTSD. And when we start looking at each one of these things, it's kind of hard to say, well, what is the real cause? So let's just jump into causes. Well, if it's military combat, years ago, decades ago, they didn't classify that. They classified it as something else. But military combat, yes, and they are getting better about it. It's one of those things that is being treated more effectively. Sometimes there's a violent assault. It could be a natural disaster, a hurricane, a flood, earthquake, or it could be some other life-threatening event, COVID, for instance. A lot of different causes for PTSD. And sometimes what may be life-threatening to me may not be life-threatening to somebody else. It's all our own perception. Now, because we know there's a trauma usually involved with PTSD, most of the treatments deal with some type of cognitive behavior. So you have this thing called cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy. In one case, you're dealing with the specific, another case you're talking about just talking. And each one of these things have a detailed explanation of what they are and why they're not something else. But another therapy is called prolonged exposure, brief eclectic psychotherapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR therapy, narrative exposure therapy, NET. The medications they typically give somebody with PTSD is Zoloft, Paxil, and Prozac. Sometimes meditation works very, very well. Sometimes because of our diets, it allows us to hone in on what we might be lacking and be able to give our bodies and our brains that extra amount of attention that it's needed. Again, sometimes something simple as exercise, whether it's a long walk, hot sunshine, swimming, doesn't matter. But we're getting out and we're doing something, we're getting more oxygen flow to the brain. Let me just talk briefly on hypnotherapy before I kind of wrap these things up. I have a very good friend here in Houston, and I've said in a couple of sessions that he's had where he will demonstrate hypnotherapy, particularly for people with PTSD, some military people that have volunteered. And he will start out, just, okay, think about what caused the problem. It could have been some event over in the war zone. And he'll say, if you're seeing this event in color, turn it to black and white. And you kind of see the people kind of back up automatically. They kind of lose the intensity because the color isn't there. He'll say, okay, visualize this thing on your big screen TV. Now let's bring it down to maybe the size of your laptop. Now bring it down to the size of your cell phone. And so when you start narrowing the ability to see the problem, like he says, sometimes says, depending on the nature, maybe you want to go back to the size of your computer screen. And what if you turn the computer screen 45 degrees away from you, where you pull the left side up and the right side back? Well, sometimes looking at it from a different perspective changes things in the brain. And so hypnotherapy is very, very good. And I've seen some very good demonstrations on that. So let's move on here. And I'm going to call it quits there, 30 minutes-ish. And we will be talking on some of the other issues next week and then getting into some more detail. But anyway, this is red.olaughlin with Talking Heads. We're talking about brain health and mental illness, primarily mental illness today and next week. And I have 2 books, one out on Joy of Ageless Health that talks about the causes of disease in general, and another one called Longevity Secrets for Healthy Aging that talks about the 2 primary causes of aging, your human growth hormone that wanes over time, and the length of your telomeres every time your DNA splits and becomes two. So there are things you can do to address all those issues. They're available on Amazon or my website, red.olaughlin.com. Again, Red O'Laughlin, it's RedOlaughlin.com. And I can be reached at red@redolaughlin.com for those people. But again, signing off on the Talking Heads show on the USA Global TV and Radio Network.